Okay, let's dive in. You've shared some really powerful source material today.
hmm
And it starts by capturing this feeling. Well, a feeling a lot of people might recognize. Maybe you've heard you sound too articulate for autism.
Right. Or maybe someone asked if you were ever sent out of class enough for ADHD.
Exactly. As if, staying in your seat somehow negates all the executive function struggles.
And the feeling the source describes, it's not relief when that happens.
No. It says it feels like being erased.
Yeah, that feeling of being unseen, especially by the systems meant to help, that's really at the heart of this material we're looking at.
hmm
So today we're doing a deep dive into these excerpts, looking at diagnostic tools, the frameworks, specifically why so many AuDHD individuals, that's autistic and ADHD, get misdiagnosed or just missed completely.
Right. And our mission here is really to unpack the core arguments from this source material. We want to get the why.
Yeah.
Why do current approaches fail so often, according to this piece?
And then explore what a different way of seeing could look like.
Exactly. All drawn specifically from the source material for you listening.
Okay, so where does the source start pinpointing the problem?
Well, it talks about a fundamental issue. Our diagnostic systems are built on what it calls a kind of diagnostic mirage.
A mirage based on flawed frameworks?
Yeah, and the core argument is that these systems rely way too heavily on just observable behavior, what you can see on the outside.
The external stuff. And it highlights two key frameworks that sort of set the stage historically.
Right. For autism, it's often this frame of lack.
Lack, yeah. A perceived absence of things like, typical eye contact, maybe a flatter effect, less outward emotional expression.
And the source traces this back, mentions Kanner in 1943, but also notes how it persists, like in Dean et al.'s work from 2017.
And then for ADHD, the source says that's usually viewed through a lens of disruption.
Disruption, so traits that are more intrusive, outwardly noticeable.
Exactly. Impulsivity, hyperactivity, trouble staying on task,
Yeah.
the things that tend to draw attention. It points to research like Liabal from 2021 here.
So the argument the source makes is that this sets up a kind of diagnostic binary.
A binary, yeah. You either have to look like you fail to connect socially in the expected way, or you fail to contain yourself, your energy, within those expected norms. You have to fit one of those boxes to be easily seen.
Mm-hmm. And that creates a real paradox for AuDHD individuals, doesn't it?
It does, because, as the source explains, they often present quite differently on the surface.
How so?
Well, they might seem emotionally tuned in, socially quite fluent, maybe intellectually really engaged.
Right. But, and this is crucial in the source material, that fluency. It's often not effortless. It's described as a performance.
A performance, exactly. Something honed over years through masking or camouflaging, internalizing a huge amount of distress while doing it.
Yeah, it references studies like Evans et al., Pearson and Rose on this point.
And this is where you see that stark contrast the material talks about.
Like what?
Like appearing deeply empathic on the outside, but being completely dysregulated inside.
Or speaking really eloquently, but struggling with, basic daily tasks.
Precisely. Participating in a conversation, managing all the cues, while internally just enduring massive sensory overwhelm.
So because they don't fit neatly into lack or disruption?
They often just aren't recognized by these older frameworks. They fall through the cracks.
And the source really ties this back to the history, the structural design of these systems.
Yeah, it does. It mentions how early autism research, like Kanner's work, was really shaped by behaviorism, focusing on what you could see, that visible detachment.
And similarly for ADHD.
It points out those frameworks grew mostly from observing disruptive behaviors, specifically in white cisgender boys in schools,
Okay.
referencing work like Mao et al. From just 2024. So the criteria got tied up with fitting into institutional norms.
Which meant what for others?
It meant that people who internalize their distress, and the source specifically calls out girls, BIPOC individuals, gender diverse people, they were often just seen as coping. Or maybe being resilient, not actually struggling in a way that needed recognizing.
Ah, right. And that leads to what the source calls a really dangerous substitution.
Yeah.
Where presentation becomes a proxy for pathology.
Exactly. The assumption becomes, if you don't look chaotic or avoidant in the way we expect,
Then there's no real issue there.
right. Which, of course, systematically misses anyone who's developed ways to hide their distress. Adaptive strategies born from trauma, social pressure, just necessity.
And the source argues the system kind of rewards that appearance of normalcy. while punishing the huge effort it takes. Citing McQuaid et al. 2021, people who camouflage well get disbelieved.
Dismissed as just anxious or dramatic or difficult.
Yeah.
And the source is really clear here. This isn't just about missing some nuance. It calls it a structural design flaw. When diagnosis hinges on visibility, it just structurally excludes internal experiences, relational struggles, things obscured by culture or pressure. And for marginalized folks, the source says, this invisibility is a form of systemic violence.
It's a really strong point. And it leads us into what the source calls the quiet middle.
The quiet middle, where masking lives and scrambles the signals clinicians might be looking for.
So how does the source define masking in this context?
It describes it as essentially clinical misdirection. It's not that the traits aren't there, but it's a performance of control, often like precision engineered because of social threat.
And it emphasizes it's often a survival strategy, right? Not really a choice.
Definitely. Especially for marginalized people, it points to work by Craddock, Pearson, and Rose.
And what does that actually involve, according to the source, the masking itself?
Oh, it's described as constant translation. Translating every impulse, every gesture, every expression into something acceptable.
Like smiling through sensory pain.
Yeah, or rehearsing conversation scripts, suppressing stims or natural movements, managing your voice volume, studying eye contact.
Wow. The source uses the phrase, holding the body hostage.
It does. And this adaptive fluency, as it's sometimes called, it just completely scrambles the clinical signals.
That's so.
Well, appearing composed or articulate or good at mimicking social cues, it leads diagnosticians to just discount the underlying distress or difficulties.
So clinicians looking for the more stereotypical signs might miss this quiet middle.
Completely miss it. That space where, intense executive dysfunction might exist alongside perfectionism, or where sensory overload leads to an internal shutdown, not a visible meltdown. Dean et al. Talked about this back in 2017, too.
And the result.
A wave of false negatives, the source argues, especially for adults diagnosed late. People who spent years being told, well, you're just anxious, or you're too emotional, or even praised for being resilient. Evans et al., McQuaid et al. Cover this.
And this gets even more complex with intersectionality.
Absolutely. The source gives examples, autistic Black girls being misread as oppositional or aggressive.
Right, citing Ames et al., Mandel et al.
Queer and trans youth layering camouflage for safety across different parts of their lives.
Yeah.
Autistic women and AFAB folks may be succeeding at social mimicry, but paying a huge internal price. Craddock and Dean et al. Explore this.
So the whole process, the source says, just filters out anyone who doesn't fit that very narrow historical prototype.
Exactly.
Which makes sense then, that the diagnostic tools themselves would play a role in this. They're not neutral observers.
No, the source argues they act as amplifiers for these distortions. They filter everything through norms that, as we've said, weren't neutral to begin with.
And the source asks that really critical question, who were these tools actually built for? Who were they normed on?
And the answer it gives is pretty clear.
Right.
Primarily white cisgender boys in Western settings.
Right. It mentions tools like the 802, Conners scales, even the DSM structure itself, citing Lai et al., Mao et al. Again.
So by their very design, these tools are better at picking up public disruption.
Not the internal stuff, not the private struggle, the exhaustion from self-monitoring.
Precisely. Not what the source is highlighting in that quiet middle.
And looking intersectionally again.
The tools perpetuate the misreadings. Black girls seen as defiant. It makes things harder for queer trans youth, masking for safety. It misses the cost for autistic women, AFAB folks, skilled at mimicry.
And the kicker is, these groups are often left out of the studies that are supposed to validate the tools in the first place.
Exactly. It creates what the source calls a recursive loop, kind of an internalized survivorship bias.
How does that work?
Well, only the people who didn't mask effectively, who fit the prototype, were the ones primarily studied.
Yeah.
So the tools get validated based on them, and then they keep finding only what they were built to find, reinforcing the original bias. They miss what they weren't trained to see.
And the source is really emphatic here. This isn't just an oops, a benign oversight.
No, it calls it a systemic failure. Treating narrow norms as universal creates this distorted mirror, reflecting only a tiny slice of reality.
So for anyone outside that frame, diagnosis becomes a barrier. Exclusion, even re-traumatization.
Given all that, the source argues just tweaking the criteria isn't going to cut it.
Not enough.
No. It calls for changing the whole lens. The problem isn't just clarity, it's the method, the framework, what even counts as evidence.
So it contrasts the traditional approach focusing on observable behavior, standardized tests, measuring against norms.
Yeah, it contrasts that with an alternative, an approach grounded in listening, starting with the person.
And it talks about emerging approaches trying to do this.
Right. Things that center narrative, developmental trajectories seen differently, relational self-understanding. It mentions some specific tools, too.
Like the CATQ, the Camouflaging Autistic Traits Questionnaire.
Exactly, which, as Evans et al. Discuss, tries to measure the effort of masking, making that hidden cost visible. And the RADES, which, it has limitations, but it's mentioned as trying to get at more internal states, sensory stuff, language processing nuances, emotional complexity, things often missed in standard interviews.
But it sounds like the source puts more weight on just talking. Clinician-guided conversations.
Absolutely. Conversations that really delve into lived experience, talking about sensory overwhelm, shutdown patterns, the fatigue from masking, identity impacts. The source argues these deep dives offer way more insight than just ticking boxes on a checklist.
But it's not just about new tools, is it? The source stresses changing the underlying frameworks.
Definitely. It brings up models like the power threat meaning framework, the PTMF.
How does that differ?
It reframes distress less as an internal disorder and more as a response to external threats, power dynamics, shifting from what's wrong with you to what has happened to you.
Okay. That sounds more compatible with neurodivergent experiences, as the source suggests.
Yeah, citing Johnstone and Boyle. And it also mentions the double empathy problem.
Right, Milton's concept from 2012.
Which challenges that old idea that social difficulties are only an autistic deficit. Instead, it frames communication breakdowns as relational, a mismatch when different processing styles meet, difficulty on both sides.
So these alternative models,
Yeah.
they reject the deficit idea.
Fundamentally, they see divergence as meaningful difference understood in context. And crucially, lived experience becomes the primary data, not just anecdotes, but the starting point.
Which the source frames as emancipatory for people whose stories have been ignored.
Exactly. Reclaiming the authority to define their own reality and have that be heard.
But the source is also clear about the cost when the system gets it wrong. It's not abstract.
No, it's deeply lived. It's the silence after a misdiagnosis. Years of unmet needs. The exhaustion of navigating systems telling you you're too much or not enough. These failures, the source says, they recalibrate your whole life. The damage adds up.
And it highlights something called diagnostic attrition.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. People who mask well, especially adults, might even have existing diagnoses questioned or withdrawn.
Why?
Because their performance is just so convincing. Referencing Pearson and Rose, McQuaid et al. Again, it's this cruel paradox.
The better you are at surviving,
The less likely the system is to believe you need help. It rewards your adaptation by making you invisible.
Wow. And misclassification is still common too.
Rampant, according to the source. Autistic people, especially femme-presenting, racialized queer individuals, getting misdiagnosed with BPD, anxiety, bipolar, citing Ames et al., Craddock,
And harm there?
inappropriate treatments, invalidating therapies, narratives casting real distress as manipulative or pathological. It's containment, not care. Misses the whole point.
Plus the practical stuff, right? No diagnosis often means no accommodations, no services.
Exactly. Support is just out of reach. You get told you're exaggerating or coping fine, leading to this pervasive sense of unbelonging, not just socially, but clinically. The system feels like it's actively working against you.
But the source suggests the deepest wound is just being constantly misread.
Yeah. Living in a body, a mind that experiences the world differently and being told over and over by experts that your reality is wrong, inconvenient, doesn't count.
That misunderstanding gets medicalized, institutionalized,
And used to justify withholding care, denying rights, even questioning personhood.
which leads to that internal narrative.
Maybe I am just broken. Maybe it's my fault. And from there, burnout, shutdown, isolation are almost inevitable.
So the ethical imperative, as the source presents it, it's bigger than just fixing tools.
Much bigger. It says we need to decenter pathology itself. Start by asking if the diagnostic threshold was ever built to see this person.
Look beyond the surface presentation.
Treat distress as meaningful communication, not just deviance. Put the person, their story, their experience right at the center, not the potential label.
It's a powerful reframing of the core question.
Yeah, the source basically asks, Not why are so many missed, but how does the system keep up this illusion of objectivity while managing to disappear so many people?
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today, and the sources call for a different kind of diagnostic culture, one based on witnessing.
Witnessing. The source asks, what would it mean to be seen through resonance, narrative, relational truth, not just lack or disruption?
What if diagnosis was a mirror, not a filter?
And the answer it proposes is this idea of witnessing.
Which means?
More than just observing. It's attuning to the person, holding complexity, honoring context. Recognizing divergence often bears the marks of adaptation.
So composure might signal pain. Fluency might be camouflage.
Exactly. And a missed diagnosis might reflect a history of survival. The task shifts.
From does this fit the criteria to?
2. What has this person had to survive to be missed for so long?
So a witnessing culture would center stories, ask better questions.
Trust embodied knowledge. Allow for ambiguity sometimes. Build the understanding with the person, not just apply it to them. Affirm lived experience as the primary data. Foundational.
And this isn't about abandoning diagnosis.
Yeah. No, the source calls it diagnostic integrity. We still need language, frameworks, access, but they have to come from humility, from listening, not certainty based on flawed norms.
Stop forcing the self to fit the schema.
And shape the schema to reflect the self in all its complexity.
The call isn't for special treatment, but for recognition. Because of the complexity, not to spite it.
Reclaiming the right to be heard, seen, not just classified.
So to wrap up this deep dive, the core takeaway from the source is really that current systems are fundamentally flawed for many, especially AuDHD individuals who mask.
Yeah, because they prioritize visible traits tied to narrow historical prototypes, leading to misdiagnosis, delays, real harm.
And the call is for that shift towards clinical witnessing, centering lived experience, narrative, over checklists and performance.
And as you, listening, reflect on all this, here's a final thought from the source to mull over.
Where else might systems built on observable behavior be failing to see other kinds of difference, other kinds of distress, beyond neurodivergence?
Yeah. Where else might we be mistaking appearance for the underlying reality?
Something definitely worth thinking about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into this important source material.